that we could understand because our minds had been made in the image of the same rational creator who had built rationality and design and pattern and lawful order into the world.
Meyer was on the Joe Rogan show where he made a defense of intelligent design. I know what you're thinking, Doug, I'm not here to talk religion. Well, we're actually here to talk science. And the science is showing that Darwinism is no longer adequate for how species and how the differentiation of species got here. And that's being negated these days by Darwinists that are abandoning the theory. I'm Doug Tenaple. Welcome to Doug in Exile, where we talk a lot about politics. I thank you all for subscribing and for liking. And of course, I'd love to hear your comments below. This is a fascinating, crazy subject. And yes, it touches politics because the left or the Democrats are nearly entirely informed now by Darwinism, which is an atheistic, defunct form of fake science. And I advocate for creationism. It involves some evolution, but we'll get into that. First, here's Stephen Meyer on Joe Rogan.
Do you believe in evolution?
I believe in, I believe in microevolution. I believe that there are real evolutionary processes.
Okay, an evolutionary process is simply things changing over time. Now, where it differentiates from Darwin, who wrote a book called Origin of Species, that is the species in Origins, he's claiming this is where it started. That is a creation, a pagan form of creationism through purely natural selection. That's something that science has never demonstrated.
I'm skeptical about what's called universal common descent, the idea that all living forms have evolved from one single common ancestor.
And that common ancestor would be monkeys or bacteria or some single-celled, the idea that we all have one common ancestor is nowhere to be seen in science because the amount of complex information, because you'll admit that certainly that a sperm whale is more complex than a single-celled organism. So something had to account for the complexity that goes from a single-celled organism to a sloth.
I'm profoundly skeptical about chemical evolution, the idea that the non-living chemicals in a prebiotic ocean or prebiotic soup arrange themselves to form the first living cell.
That's called abiogenesis. That is the starting of life. To go from chemicals or rocks to a living cell. And remember, the living cell has to be able to reproduce itself to pass on its material to the next generation, and then have it mutate to create new information and become more complex. That model has never been demonstrated. It is not scientific.
And I'm also skeptical about the creative power of the mutation selection mechanism, which, as it happens, so are many leading evolutionary biologists today.
The evolutionary biologists, they're getting together and they're starting to meet in think tanks going, it doesn't turn anyone into a Christian, by the way. They're not turning into Christians or anything, or even theists. They're just saying this theory of evolution is no longer viable for what we need it to do. And we have to go find another theory, and they're out looking.
I attended a conference in 2016 at convened by the Royal Society in London, Royal Society being the oldest and most august scientific body in the world. And it was convened by a group of evolutionary biologists who were essentially dissatisfied with neo-Darwinism, the standard textbook theory that we learn in all high school and college textbooks. And many of them were saying we need a new theory of evolution. The first talk at that conference was given by Gerd Müller, a prominent Austrian evolutionary biologist, and he simply enumerated the five major, what he called explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism. And his basic perspective was the mutation selection mechanism does a good job of optimizing or modifying pre-existing forms.
So they're not denying that changes can occur once you already have the form there. The hard part is explaining that form. Now, Darwinism has utterly failed in what is the origin of species, that is, what created the differentiation and the complexity of things to go from a single cell to a sperm whale. He never demonstrated that. That's what's in crisis. Not that animals change or that colors change or horns develop or things like that. Once you have a character that's basically a copier changing machine, the hard part's done, but they haven't explained the hard part.
It can generate small-scale variation, but it does a very poor job of explaining the origin of those forms.
I'll go farther. It doesn't do a poor job. It does no job of explaining those forms. It's all written theory and stories, none of it demonstrated in the hard sciences. And I go back to David Hume. If you're going to be an empiricist, we can ask for and demand the greater the claim, the greater the evidence they have to provide, and none has been given.
Think about, for example, the Darwin's finch beaks. Great job of explaining how variations in weather patterns result in changes in the shape and structure of the finch beaks. But that mechanism turns out not to do a good job of explaining the origin of birds or other major animal groups in the first place.
What does this have to do with politics? Everything. Remember, politics, though, it was the left side that said, we're for science. We're the side of science. We don't believe this hocus pocus God stuff anymore. Remember, they're pro-science on the vaccine. They're pro-science on, that they claim to have found the gay gene and all this stuff. And of course, now they claim that there is a scientific fact of matter inventing itself without a supernatural creator. It does have repercussions, and it has them into politics. And I'm saying to my people on the right, you no longer have an obligation to have to believe in evolution, Darwinism. It's not scientifically viable.
Modification, yes. Innovation, no.
But modification over massive amounts of time, don't you think that would eventually lead to new groups? Because a lot of new groups have similar origins, or at least origins from one ancestor.
Well,
and there's Joe Rogan doing the typical, but just over mass amount of time modification. Surely, the problem is there's very little evidence of modification creating information, creating complexity. Those things come from minds, not matter.
Yeah, time was always the hero of the plot. We now know, thanks to the genetic revolution, the molecular biological revolution, that if you want to build a new form of life, you have you have to have new code, because all new forms of life depend upon new anatomical, a fundamentally new type of animal, for example. So you need new anatomical structures but the new anatomical structures require new cell types, new types. So if you got animals that first come on the line and they have a digestive system, they have a gut. Well, you got to have enzymes that can service a gut, that can process food. So enzymes are types of proteins. Proteins are built from the informational code in DNA. So anytime you want to get it's just like in the computer world. If you want to give your computer a new function, you've got to provide new code.
And I'll let you figure out who the mind is on this lovely Sunday Sabbath. I'm Doug in Exile.